Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here for another movie review, and today we're going to be talking about 1989's Tango and Cash. The film was directed by Andrei Konchalovsky. I think that's how you pronounce his name, and also Albert Magnoli as uncredited. And we'll talk a little bit about that situation. It stars Sylvester Stallone, Kurt Russell, Terry Hatcher, Jack Palance, Breon James, James Hong, Mark Alamo, Philip Tan, Robert Zadar, and others. The logline plot synopsis is: framed by their ruthless arch nemesis, a mismatched LAPD crime fighting duo has to put its differences aside to even the score with the evil kingpin who put them behind bars once and for all. So, yeah, Tango and Cash. This felt like a first viewing. I know somewhere in my life, somewhere on cable or on TBS or HBO or something as a child, I've probably watched Tango and Cash at least one time. Tango and Cash is weird. It's like in that vein of Stallone movies that I just am not very familiar with, and I can't really remember if I've seen or not. The other ones that came out kind of a couple years after this would be like The Specialist, Assassins, and which is weird because, it's Sylvester Stallone and Kurt Russell. And those are two guys, especially growing up, would have been like, I would have seen the vast majority of the movies that they made just because, like, of my dad, being a fan of Stallone, being a fan of Russell. So it's kind of weird that I don't have much of a nostalgia for this movie. I didn't grow up with it in a way that it's like feels like part of my childhood or meaningful in any way. So I kind of came to this with a fresh adult perspective, kind of like I got to do with a few other Stallone movies we've talked about over the year. Cobra, I never saw Cobra when I was a kid, or never at least really saw it. I never saw Nighthawks. I had never seen Lockup, that Stallone prison movie. So this kind of, and those all are kind of in the same time period. It's weird, it's strange because I'm familiar with all the Rocky movies and the Rambo movies, and then you kind of jump into the '90s with like Demolition Man, Cliffhanger, like the big ones. Like those are the ones that I was most familiar with from Stallone from that era. But yeah, just like right off the bat, Tango and Cash is one of these times where it's like the sum is most definitely greater than its parts. There's so many times in this movie that you feel kind of befuddled by what's going on, and and the tone of the movie and some of the weird choices of the performances and the way it's structured. It's a very weird movie. A lot of that has to do with the fact that there was tons of production trouble. There's like actually they on IMDb here, it's like it says there's two directors. This Konchalovsky guy, which I'm not familiar with, and Albert Magnoli, who I believe was a producer on the film, if I'm not mistaken, and he ends up kind of closing out the movie. Oh, he directed Purple Rain. Oh, I didn't know that. He directed Purple Rain. Look at that. An episode of Joe Bob's Drive-In, Street Night, and a bunch of Prince music videos, a bunch of couple Patti Smith music videos. But yeah, he came in to kind of be the closer, I suppose, for the movie. But in between that, like another producer had taken some directorial duties. Sylvester Stallone himself was like kind of shadow directing it, and I think you could kind of say maybe he shadow directed the whole thing. And the reason why they end up firing this Andrei Konchalovsky guy 3 months into shooting. So most of the bulk of principal photography is that he wanted it to be more serious and darker and harder edged. And all other things as well, like Stallone fired the original DP, Sonnenfeld, Barry Sonnenfeld, who's a great DP. He's a great DP. You can go back and look at some of his work with the Coen brothers. I mean, look at Blood Simple. Like just a really like a talented DP, and he's obviously a storied person at this point in terms of his work. People know who he is. People know who Barry Sonnenfeld is and respect his work greatly. But for whatever reason, Stallone was did not like the way that Sonnenfeld was lighting him, so he got rid of him. Because just since we're talking about it, the photography in this movie is very kind of basic. It's kind of bland in a lot of parts. There's some parts that feel more cinematic, but it almost feels like it's shot like a television show. like a Miami Vice or something from the era, and maybe not even as dynamic. It's very flat. It's a very flat movie in that way. So yeah, there's tons of problems with the production of the film, and even post-production. I think was they actually hired like an editor. Nobody that was involved in the writing or in the directing or the acting actually had access to the editing bay. They hired somebody, and they came in and they cut the movie up. It's kind of like what happened to David Ayer with Suicide Squad, just as another Warner Brothers movie. But yeah, and then they just kind of created a product and got it out when it was supposed to come out, because Stallone was a big bankable name, Kurt Russell a big bankable name. They had like a date lined up. They were trying to get this movie out. They wanted it to be kind of a buddy comedy in the cop movie in the same vein as like Lethal Weapon. And you could see kind of that when you watch the movie. Like, it wants to be a more lighthearted, more kind of overtly comedic version of a Lethal Weapon movie. Now, you could say, like, once they get to Lethal Weapon 3 and Lethal Weapon 4, well, that's kind of what that series turned into. But at the time, 1989, I think there was only 2 Lethal Weapon movies out at the time, so they didn't have that. And those first 2 movies, while they're funny and there's jokes and there's crazy shit happens, but they're much like more serious stories. They're much darker edged. This one almost feels like a comic book. Like the villains are like very cartoony. Like Jack Palance is like kind of the shadowy leader of this group, where Tango and Cash are like the bane of his existence. And just the way it's presented, even like once it gets to the end, they like basically like storm like the fortress or whatever of the bad guys. It also just kind of maintains that kind of silly, goofy, over the top kind of weirdness to it. But it seems like it's like different departments and the different visionaries, the different directors rather, that were involved in putting this together. Like, it seems like none of them agreed on the movie they were making, the kind of movie, the tone of the movie. Because it is all over the place. But by the time the credits rolled, I was actually felt like I was having a pretty good time. Even sometimes in spite of the movie itself. Like, sometimes it's just like, oh my God, some of this dialogue is so cringe. So this story is very contrived. It makes no sense. The character motivations are weird and off-putting. Stallone was playing this weird kind of straight character. In terms of like the comedic sensibilities, because you have Kurt Russell is basically playing like a Martin Riggs type character from Lethal Weapon, which, if you don't know, Russell was actually offered the part of Martin Riggs and turned it down. So, oops. Good for Mel Gibson though. So yeah, it's got all this weird stuff. Like, I mean, just going back to the dialogue. This is like a primo example of the kind of quips, the kind of one-liners that are in the movie. Like Stallone, one of these guys that fucked up the case, which leads Tango and Cash to go to jail. Like, they break out of prison, they go hunt these guys down, these expert witnesses. They go to go question them, get them to recant or whatever. And the guy's pulling out like a plate of spaghetti out of the fridge. Stallone startles him. He drops the plate of spaghetti. Stallone looks down at the plate of spaghetti and says, "Well, I can see you're not on a diet and you're not counting calories. Is that because you're too busy counting the payoff money given to you by the bad guys?" Like, and the movie is full of lines like that, full of it, which ends up becoming kind of endearing. It becomes part of the larger tapestry of the movie. It's like almost like the motif of the movie is like cringy dad joke cheesiness. Because they clearly wanted to make something that was kind of fun and light, and that you would like kind of an action comedy adventure flick. And most of the time it does feel that way. It just feels that way in you get such whiplash sometimes from what's going on and from scene to scene, and then the plot itself is it's straightforward, but they really overcomplicate it in a way that sometimes I was just like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we going here? Like, why are we making it this many layers of this? It doesn't need to be like this, because the movie can kind of get bogged down on that stuff. Another thing that makes the movie super memorable is actually it has a great supporting cast. Stallone and Russell, obviously, they're doing something here, something interesting. I think sometimes they're almost feels like they're in a different movie. But like Jack Palance as the bad guy, even though he doesn't have a ton of screen time, is super great. Who else? Robert Zudar. If you're like a action movie fan, if you grew up with like cable in the 80s and 90s, you would know who Robert Zudar is. Dude, giant fucking chin. He's Maniac Cop. Have you ever seen the Maniac Cop movies? Kind of a staple of like action movies of the 80s and 90s. Mostly direct-to-video stuff, mostly low-budget stuff. But he's a very kind of memorable screen presence when you see him. The guy that stood out to me, though, is Breon James, who is in one of my all-time favorite movies. He's in The Fifth Element. He plays General Monroe. But he's been all over stuff. He's like in Blade Runner. He's one of the replicants on the run. He's in Striking Distance with Bruce Willis. He's in Another 48 Hours. The guy got around back then, and he's always very solid, like a solid character actor, always coming in doing these like kind of great, very memorable bit parts. And in this one, he does something I've never seen him do before, which is put on an accent. He does like a British accent, which becomes kind of a joke, somewhat of a running joke in the movie. And he's definitely a bright spot in the cast. And I think the cast, though, like just in general, if any, like everybody is there is good. And they're doing kind of hammy, kind of broad performances. And it makes the movie endearing. Because you could sit there and try to pick it apart and be really, really brutal about it and be like, oh, the structure doesn't make any sense. All these characters, they don't make any sense. The motivations, what the fuck? What's going on with the plot? Like, why are we doing this? Some of the things that I thought. But, by the end, like once you've experienced the whole package, I kind of came away pretty positive on the movie. If you don't know, I have a Letterboxd account. Letterboxd is kind of like social media for movies. And I usually... Well, I at least put up that I watched something on there. And I used to use it kind of just as like a memory thing. Like, so I could look back on the year. What have I watched? You know, you can catalog everything. You can write little reviews and stuff. And I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I think it really won me over by the end, even while completely acknowledging that it kind of doesn't work. It kind of doesn't work. And I think a lot of the reasons is probably just the fact that it's kind of it became like this Frankenstein's monster studio movie. And the people that end up finishing this movie are not like creative types. They're kind of just studio executives and producers. So maybe they weren't so keyed into like how to make this fit together completely and coherently. Not to say that it doesn't like make sense or anything like that. But you are going to, feels like there's plot holes left and right, and like the logical leaps to get these people where they need to be just for the story, for the sake of the story, sometimes honestly just doesn't really make much sense. You're just kind of confused about it, and it is what it is. And then they never delve into the stuff like they have with Kurt Russell's character, especially. Cash. He's like very shady dude. Who even thinks that Terry Hatcher, who plays Stallone's sister, he thinks that's Stallone's girlfriend. And he's still like all about what he's doing. He's just kind of a slime ball. And that's part of their characters, right? Like they're kind of a yin and yang, but they're both super cops. They're both the best in the biz. They just have different methodologies, and they have to come together to kind of learn how to work together to overcome this greater threat to their lives. And it tries to kind of shoehorn in every once in a while like some sentimentality, especially towards the end of the movie, which just reads more as like funny than anything else. But I'm glad I watched it. It was kind of crazy. I was just like looking at my movie shelf, pulling out a few things maybe I'd check out like within the next couple weeks. Sometimes I do that. I'll just like create a stack, and like I pulled out like Tombstone. And then I saw, just out of the corner of my eye, it was like Tango and Cash. It was still in the shrink wrapping. I was like, holy shit. I completely forgot that I bought Tango and Cash like 6 months ago. So I just like put it on the shelf, thinking I'm going to get to it eventually. I'll get to it. I'll see it there. But yeah, I completely forgot that I had access to Tango and Cash. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad I watched it. I had a lot of fun with it. I'll probably revisit it sometime in the near future. It's a movie that like I think would probably grow on you as well, like under like reassessment. I could see it becoming like a personal favorite. Maybe not something I would defend, or I would be like, yo, you got to watch Tango and Cash. That's the best shit ever. but it kind of spoke to a lot of my very specific, like, idiosyncratic sensibilities about these kinds of movies. And I like the fact that it doesn't really work. So you have to kind of like take take that for what it is. There's a lot of stuff in this movie I just don't think works on an individual level, but somehow all together it created something interesting at the very least. And something I'll definitely want to like revisit sometime, probably in the near future. I had a good time. I had a good time watching it this afternoon. And I think a part of that was like I really had no expectations for it. I mean, I knew what Tango and Cash very broadly was, but I didn't know what to expect when I turned it on. I didn't even realize that it was supposed to be more of a comedy. And I don't know how. I don't know how. I didn't know that, but I didn't. So I had no expectations for it. So, the movie never lost me because I was always enjoying it, even as I was kind of befuddled. But by the end, it kind of won me over. I had a good time with it. You should check it out. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to know more about Zoobox, there's a bunch of links in the description for Facebook, for Instagram, for my Twitter, for my brother Dan's Twitter. Also, check out our other YouTube channel. That's an alternative YouTube channel on there, just in case anything happens to this one. And also our DLive page. I do a lot of live streaming, or at least a few times a week. We've been doing it over on DLive just to kind of, feel out alternative platforms and whatnot. And they're pretty lax with what you can get away with in terms of like giving commentary to a copyrighted video is pretty easy over there. Whereas on YouTube, it'll automatically pull my stream down even if I'm commentating over it or whatever. So I don't know. So we're doing stuff over there. So go check it out. All right, everybody. You have the best day ever. Goodbye.